My life was quiet and measured, like the calm flow of a river. I had a job at the local library, which brought me pleasure, and every evening I would return home to my husband, Louis. We had been married for 10 years, and although our relationship wasn't without its challenges, it was solid, built on trust and mutual respect. Everything seemed so familiar until Carlos burst into our lives. Carlos, an old friend of Louis, had always been somewhat of a mystery to me. They had met in university, but then their paths diverged, and Carlos moved to another city. Louis rarely spoke of him, and I only occasionally heard about his successes in business. So, when Louis told me that Carlos was moving to our city and would be staying with us for a while, I reacted with mild surprise, but nothing more. On the day of his arrival, Louis asked me to meet Carlos as he was delayed at work. I agreed without hesitation, thinking it would be a simple formality. When Carlos pulled up to our house, I smiled at him, trying to appear welcoming. We hadn't seen each other in a long time, and I was glad for the chance to reconnect. Carlos was just as I remembered him, tall, confident, with that easy smile that could disarm anyone. But something was off. I noticed something new in his gaze that made me tense up. It was a subtle feeling, like a sudden chill wind sweeping through the room. We sat in the living room. I offered him coffee, and we began to talk. He spoke about his work, about how he had long thought of returning to his hometown. His words were familiar, but there was something behind them that I couldn't immediately grasp. With every word he spoke, I felt a growing unease. It was hard to pinpoint where this feeling came from, but it grew with every minute. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was due to his long absence, or the fact that we had both changed over the years. But something inside me suggested it was something else. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. When Louis finally returned home, I felt a sense of relief, as if his presence could dispel the strange tension. But when the three of us sat down for dinner, I found that I couldn't take my eyes off Carlos. Every gesture, every word he said, seemed to carry a hidden meaning. Louis noticed nothing. He was happy to see his old friend, while I tried to act as usual. But inside I was in turmoil. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I lay in bed, listening to Louis' steady breathing, trying to understand what was happening. Why was I reacting so sharply to Carlos's presence? I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue, but my heart told me otherwise. His words, his looks, kept spinning in my head. I knew that this encounter would change something in my life, but I couldn't yet grasp how much. It all started that day when Carlos arrived in our city. His arrival was the drop that stirred the calm waters of my life, forcing me to look at it differently. A few days passed, and I tried not to give too much importance to my feelings, attributing them to the usual anxiety of meeting someone from the past. But the strange sensation inside me didn't go away. Instead, it intensified with each passing day. I noticed that I was thinking about Carlos more and more, recalling his words and glances as if they were more than just friendly gestures. One evening, Carlos invited Louis and me to dinner at a cozy restaurant on the outskirts of town to celebrate his return. I hesitated, not wanting to go, but Louis insisted. He was happy to see his old friend, and I didn't want to spoil his mood. That evening, I dressed with particular care, not fully understanding for whom I was doing it. For my husband or for Carlos. The restaurant was quiet, a cozy place where we could enjoy each other's company without being distracted by outside noises and conversations. We sat at a table by the window with a view of the night city lit by streetlights. The conversation began easily and effortlessly. We laughed, reminiscing about old stories. Louis talked about his work plans and Carlos listened attentively. But I felt his gaze linger on me too often. It was like a light touch that made me uncomfortable. When Louis stepped out briefly to take a phone call, I felt the tension suddenly rise. I was left alone with Carlos, and the silence between us felt deafening. He looked at me, and leaning slightly closer, quietly said, "Helena, I've been wanting to tell you something for a long time." His voice was soft, but there was a determination in it that made me tense up. I didn't know what to expect, but I already felt something irreversible coming. "Carlos," I tried to interrupt him. "Please don't," but he continued, ignoring my words. "I can't keep silent anymore. Since I saw you again, I realized I never forgot you. What I feel is more than just friendship, and I think you feel it too." These words stunned me like a bolt from the blue. I stared at Carlos, unable to speak. Everything I had been feeling over the past few days suddenly became clear and frighteningly real. I did have feelings for him, but I was afraid to admit it even to myself. These feelings disrupted the harmony I had built for years. I knew that if I uttered a single word now, I would destroy everything I held dear. Lewis returned to the table, and the tension in the room abruptly shifted to forced cheerfulness. I tried to behave as usual, but inside I was trembling. I avoided looking at Carlos, fearing he would see in my eyes the emotions I was desperately trying to hide. The entire evening passed in a strange mix of strained politeness and inner turmoil. We returned home, but I felt like a stranger. My heart was in turmoil, and I knew that things couldn't go on like this. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Thoughts of Carlos, his words, his gaze, wouldn't let me rest. I kept thinking that this was all wrong, that I needed to stay away from him. But I already understood that once a spark of attraction ignites, it can't simply be extinguished. It grew inside me like a fire, just waiting for a drop of oil to flare up again with renewed intensity. After that evening, I decided that I needed to keep my distance from Carlos. I understood that our meetings were becoming too dangerous, that something had developed between us that could ruin my life. I resolved to avoid him, hoping that time would smooth out the sharp edges that had appeared in our relationship. But as often happens, fate had other plans. A few days later, Lewis went on another business trip, leaving me alone in the house. This was a regular occurrence, and I had always spent my time alone peacefully, doing household chores and losing myself in books. But this time, I felt different. Every moment seemed to stretch endlessly, and I couldn't shake thoughts of Carlos. His confession, his voice, his eyes, all of it haunted me like a shadow. On the third day of my solitude, I heard the doorbell ring. When I opened the door, there was Carlos, standing on the threshold with a calm expression. "Hello, Helena," he said with a slight smile. "I thought you might be bored and decided to stop by." My heart began to race, but I tried to stay composed. Courtesy and common sense told me I shouldn't let him in. But something inside made me step aside, allowing him into the house. "Hello, Carlos. Of course, come in," I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. We walked into the living room, and he sat down on the couch, glancing around. I offered him coffee, avoiding eye contact. The room was filled with a strange silence, broken only by the sound of the boiling kettle. I could feel the tension between us growing with every passing minute. I brought 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him, hoping that casual conversation might ease the atmosphere. We talked about mundane things, about little details that usually mean nothing, but at that moment seemed important, because they distracted us from what was really happening. However, I noticed that my words were becoming more disjointed and my thoughts were getting tangled. I could feel his presence almost physically, as if he were much closer than he actually was. At some point, our conversation faded and a silence fell between us, tense like a stretched string. Carlos suddenly stood up and approached me. Stopping just inches away, I looked up and saw that he was gazing at me with such depth and seriousness that it took my breath away. "Helena," he whispered, reaching out and gently touching my face. "I can't hide this any longer." His touch was soft, almost weightless, but it made all my feelings explode. I wanted to pull away to tell him that this was wrong, but I couldn't. My body betrayed me. I couldn't take a step back. I looked into his eyes and felt the chasm between us disappear, leaving only this tension that I could no longer ignore. Carlos slowly leaned toward me, his face coming closer. I could feel his breath on my skin, and in that moment, the entire world narrowed down to this single instant. I knew I should stop, that this would destroy everything I had. But I couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it would burst from my chest. And then he kissed me. His lips touched mine gently, but in that touch, there were so many unspoken emotions that I lost the ability to think. In that moment, everything that was wrong, that seemed impossible, vanished. All that remained was this feeling, a feeling that consumed me completely. When our lips finally parted, I felt something inside me collapse. I looked at Carlos and saw that he felt the same. We stood in silence, realizing that we had taken a step from which there was no turning back. That kiss marked the beginning of something new, something dangerous and inevitable. Carlos stepped back, as if giving me time to collect myself. I felt my hands trembling, and I tried to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like leaves in the wind. I knew that this moment had changed everything. The days after that fateful kiss turned into a torturous struggle with myself. I tried to return to my usual life, but nothing worked. In every glance Lewis gave me, I saw the reflection of my guilt. Every touch from him reminded me that I had betrayed his trust. But the worst part was realizing that I couldn't stop what had started between Carlos and me. We began meeting in secret. Our encounters were rare and brief, but each one became more desirable and inevitable for me. We met in secluded places, in a park on the outskirts of town, in deserted cafes where no one knew us. Each time I promised myself it would be the last. But as soon as we were alone, all my promises crumbled to dust. One day, Lewis unexpectedly announced that he had to go on an extended business trip to a neighboring city. For several days, I would be alone, and although this gave me the chance to reflect on everything that was happening, I felt a growing sense of anxiety. I knew Carlos would want to see me, and I understood that this time, it would not just be a meeting, but something more, something that could destroy everything for good. Carlos called me the morning of Lewis's departure. His voice was calm, but I detected a hidden tension in it. He suggested we meet that evening in the park. I hesitated for a long time, but eventually agreed, even though everything inside me screamed that I was making a mistake. I spent the entire day in agonizing contemplation, but when evening came, I still went to the meeting. The park was deserted, the sky was overcast, and there was a sense of impending rain in the air. Carlos was waiting for me on a bench, hidden in the shadow of the trees. I approached him, and he looked up. There was so much warmth and understanding in his gaze that, for a moment, I forgot about everything except the two of us. We sat down together, and a silence settled between us, the kind of silence where we both knew that words no longer mattered. "Helena," he said, taking my hand, "I can't hide this any longer. I don't want to pretend anymore." His words struck a deep chord within me. I knew he was right, but I couldn't accept that our feelings would destroy everything I had with Lewis. I felt my heart clench with pain, but I couldn't find the strength to change anything. We sat like that for a long time, absorbed in our thoughts and feelings, until the rain began. Carlos suggested we go to my house to take shelter from the storm, and I agreed without thinking about what that might mean. We ran through the park, laughing like two children, unafraid of the rain or the storm. When we arrived at my house, I realized I had made a fatal mistake. Our wet hair and clothes clung to us from the rain, but that didn't matter. I felt a wave of desire washing over me, and I knew I couldn't fight it any longer. We were too close to each other, and a moment later, Carlos kissed me again, but this time it was different. This kiss wasn't just about passion. It was also filled with desperation, with the understanding that we might not have another chance. But at that very moment, I heard the front door open. My heart froze. Lewis had come home. I pulled away from Carlos, overwhelmed by fear, and walked towards the hallway where Lewis was standing, drenched from the rain and looking confused. "Lewis," I began, but I didn't have time to finish. His gaze locked onto Carlos, who had stepped out of the living room, and I saw the confusion in Lewis's eyes quickly turn to rage. Everything happened in an instant. He walked up to Carlos and without a word struck him. I screamed and rushed to them, trying to stop Lewis, but he was beside himself. "You betrayed me," he shouted, looking Carlos straight in the eyes. "You, my friend, and you, my wife." I tried to explain, to justify myself, but the words got stuck in my throat. All I could do was stand there and watch as my world crumbled. Lewis lunged at Carlos, and they began to fight. I tried to intervene, but was pushed aside. I had no strength left. I was completely crushed by what had happened. Finally, Carlos managed to break free, and without saying a word, ran out of the house. Lewis stood there, breathing heavily, his fists still clenched. "Leave," he finally said, not looking at me. "I don't want to see you anymore." I realized it was all over. My heart shattered, but I knew there was nothing I could do to change it. I gathered my things and left the house, leaving behind the life I had spent so long building. The rain kept pouring down, and I walked through the streets, not knowing where I was going. Inside, there was only emptiness and the realization that I had lost everything I once had.